Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're not just flipping through a history book, we're going on a deep, investigative dive into the exact timeline, the hidden mechanics, and honestly, the devastating cover-ups behind the absolute worst nuclear power plant accident in human history. We're talking about Chernobyl.
At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, 1986, a routine safety test turned into the world's worst nuclear disaster. Within seconds, Reactor No. 4 exploded, releasing radioactive material across Europe. Now, that's not just some dramatic movie script. That was the terrifying reality of that night. Over the next few minutes, we're going to trace the exact minute-by-minute sequence of engineering failures, human decisions, and systemic secrecy that led right up to this catastrophic moment.
To really understand how this happened, we got to go back and look at the history. Right after World War II, the Soviet Union went all in on nuclear power. Fast forward to 1984, and the Chernobyl plant near Pripyat, Ukraine, had 4 fully operational RBMK reactors. This whole setup was hailed as the absolute pinnacle of Soviet engineering. I mean, they even custom-built the utopian city of Pripyat just to house the thousands of workers and their families. It was filled with young people, a real sense of optimism, and a ton of pressure to project state power through cutting-edge tech. But hiding right beneath all that Soviet pride were some fatal, completely uncommunicated flaws in the very design of their reactors. So let's talk about the physics for a second, because the RBMK reactor had a terrifying underlying flaw. It's called a positive void coefficient. Basically, a reactor is cooled by boiling water, which naturally creates steam bubbles or voids. Well, in this specific design, when the water boiled and made more of these steam voids, it actually increased the nuclear chain reaction. And you can see where this is going, right? More reactivity means more heat. More heat causes more boiling, which creates more voids, which drives the reaction even higher. It was literally an uncontrollable positive feedback loop. Now, looking at the official IAEA reports, it's clear just how much this void coefficient depended on the actual makeup of the core. The original designs claimed it would be negative, meaning it would self-regulate and slow down. But the reality was way more dangerous. The void coefficient varied wildly. You see, the designers were pushing hard for high economic efficiency, but doing that totally violated established safety standards of the time. And the most tragic part? The operators working the floor were kept completely in the dark about the extreme danger this posed.
But unfortunately, the design flaws didn't stop there. Think about the control and safety rods. These are basically the emergency brakes meant to shut down the reactor if things go wrong. Well, in the RBMK, these rods had graphite displacer tips. This meant that when a fully withdrawn rod was lowered back into the core, that graphite tip briefly caused a localized spike in positive reactivity. So hitting the brakes actually hit the gas pedal first. And to make matters worse, these things were incredibly slow. It took a sluggish 18 seconds for the rods to fully drop into the core.
Which brings us to the day of the test, April 25, 1986. The whole point of the test was to see if the spinning turbines could keep the coolant pumps running during a brief power outage. At 1 a.m., operators started a scheduled power reduction. By 2 p.m., they completely disabled the emergency core cooling system so it wouldn't interfere with their data. But then, regional authorities called in and asked for a delay to meet the power grid's afternoon demands. This delay turned out to be fatal. By 11:10 p.m., the prepared day shift had already clocked out and gone home. A vastly less experienced night shift, who supposedly never even got proper instructions, was left holding the bag, taking over an incredibly delicate and now heavily compromised procedure. So what happens next is the ultimate tipping point. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26, the reactor's thermal power unexpectedly plummets. It nearly stalls out, dropping down to just 30 megawatts, which is way below any kind of stable operating level. When power drops this drastically, a gas called xenon starts to build up inside the core. It effectively poisons the reactor, making it incredibly stubborn and difficult to raise the power back up. So now, the operators are desperate. They need to get the power back up to finish the test, so they start breaking the rules. They withdrew almost all of the 211 control rods completely out of the core. Because of this, the operating reactivity margin tanked well below the absolute minimum safe limits. They cranked up the coolant flow rate way past safe bounds. And remember, they had already manually disabled the emergency core cooling system earlier that day. Without even realizing it, by overriding all these built-in safeties, the operators had basically turned Reactor No. 4 into a highly sensitive, incredibly unstable bomb that was completely reliant on perfectly flowing water to keep it from running away. Let's break down that terrifying minute-by-minute climax. At exactly 1:23 and 4 seconds a.m., the test officially begins. The steam to the turbines is shut off. As the turbine coasts down, the water flow naturally decreases. And because of that positive void coefficient we talked about earlier, steam voids rapidly form, and the power starts to surge. At 1:23 and 40 seconds, an operator realizes something is wrong and slams the EPS-5 emergency shutdown button. The control rods begin their slow descent. But remember those graphite tips? As they enter the core, they trigger a massive, fatal power spike. Within 3 seconds, power surges past 530 megawatts. The rods physically jam, and at 1:23 and 58 seconds, 2 massive explosions tear the reactor apart. The sheer physical violence of this explosion is honestly staggering to even comprehend. The explosive steam pressure from the ruptured fuel channels actually picked up the 2,000-ton upper biological shield, literally the massive cover plate of the reactor, and blasted it straight through the roof of the building. This first blast instantly flashed whatever coolant was left into pure steam. Just 2 or 3 seconds later, a second explosion, estimated to pack the equivalent punch of 225 tons of TNT, completely shattered the core and dispersed highly radioactive material straight into the night sky. Within just 5 minutes, the first military firefighters arrived on the scene. And what they were looking at was a completely destroyed reactor that resembled the glowing eye of a volcano. Burning lumps of highly radioactive graphite were everywhere, igniting fires all over the roof of the adjacent, still operating Reactor 3. These first responders rushed in to battle the blaze with absolutely zero knowledge of the lethal radiation all around them. They wore no specialized protective gear. They were literally stepping right on pieces of the exposed reactor core, making the ultimate sacrifice without even knowing what they were walking into. Now, while the plant workers and these brave firefighters were sacrificing their lives, the Soviet state's immediate instinct was secrecy. It took an agonizing 36 hours before officials finally admitted they had a problem and began evacuating the 115,000 residents of Pripyat and the surrounding areas. And even then, people were told it was just a temporary evacuation. They were instructed to pack only vital documents and enough food for 3 days. Almost all of them would never see their homes again. The contrast in how things were handled during those early days is deeply, deeply unsettling. On the front lines, you had sheer desperation. Pilots were flying helicopters directly over the open, highly radioactive crater, dumping tons of sand, clay, boron, and lead straight into the burning core just to try and choke out the emissions. They were pumping liquid nitrogen underneath to cool the melting corium. But at the state level, deep denial. They set up roadblocks but kept the true scale of the disaster completely secret. Unbelievably, on May 1st, they even allowed the massive May Day parade in nearby Kyiv to proceed as normal, exposing thousands of everyday people to the radioactive fallout drifting overhead. Ultimately, the state's massive cover-up only collapsed because the physical reality became impossible to hide. While early, totally inaccurate reports from personnel tried to blame fanciful scenarios, the truth actually came from abroad. On April 28th, Swedish air monitors detected a massive, inexplicable radioactive cloud and traced the winds right back to the USSR. It was only then, forced by this undeniable international detection, that Soviet officials finally got on the evening news and admitted that an accident had occurred. To mitigate the massive fallout spreading across Europe, they launched a sprawling, incredibly grim cleanup campaign. This involved up to 800,000 workers, who became known as the liquidators. Their jobs were just harrowing. Brave miners had to dig by hand beneath the core to prevent groundwater contamination. Teams had to wade into the dark to drain 20,000 tons of highly radioactive water from the basement, stopping what could have been a catastrophic secondary steam explosion. Liquidators bulldozed entire contaminated villages, shoveled radioactive topsoil by hand, and were even forced to shoot abandoned, radioactive pets and livestock. They gave up their own health to prevent an even larger global environmental disaster.
In the aftermath, the big question was obviously, who is to blame? Early on, the operators took the brunt of it for breaking the rules. But later, international reviews found a much deeper, more systemic truth. The root cause wasn't just on the personnel. It was heavily on a total lack of a safety culture among the reactor designers. Crucial protection functions had been silently shifted away from engineered automatic safety features and placed directly onto the shoulders of human operators. And worse, they did this without giving those operators the tools or the fundamental knowledge to even understand the fatal risks they were managing.
And this is where the story takes an even more chilling turn. Official commission findings eventually detailed major violations of safety standards in the actual technical design itself. Designers at the very highest levels just kept asserting the RBMK reactor was perfectly safe, which led to this extreme, deadly complacency. In fact, declassified KGB documents later revealed a massive secret. There had actually been a partial meltdown in Reactor 1 years earlier, back in 1982. The state had completely covered it up. It proved beyond a doubt that they prioritized their geopolitical image and electricity quotas over the actual safety of their own citizens. To try and contain the radiation that was still pouring out, they hastily ordered an incredible engineering feat. By late November 1986, just months after the explosion, workers managed to construct a massive composite steel and concrete shelter right over the wrecked reactor. This became known as the sarcophagus. The conditions were insane. Crane drivers literally had to work from specially built lead-lined control cabins just to survive the intense ambient gamma radiation while they pieced this massive shield together.
The legacy of Chernobyl wasn't just environmental, though. It was profoundly political. In 2006, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev wrote something incredible. He said, "The Chernobyl disaster, even more than my launch of perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union." The sheer scale of this tragedy, combined with the undeniable proof that the state failed to protect or even inform its own people, completely shattered whatever public trust was left in the Soviet system.
Fast forward to the present day. Because that original sarcophagus was hastily built and starting to crumble, an international consortium funded a massive replacement. Between 2016 and 2018, the new safe confinement, which is this gigantic, highly innovative steel arch, was carefully slid into place over the old structure. It's designed to contain the radioactive debris for the next century and allow for the safe dismantling of the reactor. It's a monumental cleanup effort, and it's scheduled to continue all the way until 2065.
Well, that brings us to the end of our explainer. We've looked at the physics, the timeline, the unbelievable heroism, and the dark cover-ups. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Was Chernobyl simply an engineering failure? Or was it a disaster caused by secrecy, politics, and human error? It's a heavy question, but an important one. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.